reasons that I underreport, as Ken said, is it's really a call, and some people are really strongly called to that experience. What I wanted to set up with you, and we will put something in our programs for you, is just a checklist, because we'll take pictures with us. And we can take your picture. You'll need a picture that's fairly current within this time frame now, so it doesn't have to be a portrait of professional quality, but a picture of yourself could be done on an iPhone. So wear something light, your name, birthday, address, name, birth date, address, and what you'd like prayer support for. And I will take that with me to Abidjan. That's actually what Wayne Dyer did. He had his experience remotely. And so, as Ken was saying, it's an amazing experience, but I also know it's something that people are called to. And so for me, I've tried to not come back and sell it so much as report it, because I know that certain people are called to it. And so I thank Ken for sharing. It is an experience that's very, very individual. It's very powerful. It's also, in my opinion, exactly what we teach. It's what we represent. It's why our teaching became, the foundational piece of our teaching was really around healing. And so when we look at, when we examine our lives and the journey of it, then we're able to have insight into where we might be limiting ourselves with a perception or an idea or an experience that might no longer serve us. And that's exactly the language of the Kaza. They talk about doing your part, and Ken referenced that briefly. Doing your part, which is always reaching for the highest thought possible, showing up with the expectation that something new and different is available. And that's exactly what we do here on Sundays. In the Mile High Church in Denver, they're actually doing a healing service, which I think is probably in the future for us. Where people actually come together that understand the sitting in the current, which is just meditation, holding the highest possibility of love and beauty for one another, and then coming together in the silence of that with some prayer. So I think there's definitely an opportunity for us to bring and to establish more and more of that energy here, because I think it's exactly the same language and the same vibration that you experience on a Sunday. So if you're feeling like you can't go, you can go. Just give me a picture, name, birth date, address, and what you'd like prayer support for, and we'll see what the future brings. We'll see if we go back. I'd like to return, but I'm going in a few weeks. We have about 35 people going, so it's quite wonderful to be able to bring that consciousness back with us in that experience, and I'm very grateful for that. I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I'm grateful that Ken said, "I'm going to go down. I got to go right now," and we've talked about it many times, and he did that. So it's quite lovely. There's a wonderful article in the Science of Mind magazine by Dr. Roger Teal, who I actually went with, to describe how in many ways we've gotten away from this idea of physical healing within our community. And we are a teaching that teaches anything is possible. And I love that. So on this Thanksgiving Day weekend, I wanted to bring to you something that I think is really important that probably a lot of you don't know about. But what's happening is that there's southern flying squirrels coming from the U.S. to Canada right now. They're coming up, and they're actually breeding with the northern squirrels, the Canadian squirrels. And there's a big controversy about what we should name them. And so that it's actually in the article, it says on the internet, southern flying squirrels land in Canada. It says that where the fur starts to fly south of the 49th parallel, the latitude separating Canada and the U.S., fans of the high-gliding critters say they prefer a more pan-continental approach to naming the hybrids. I feel no rivalry with Canada, but prefer North American hybrid flying squirrels, says 72-year-old Joan Barron, a retired psychiatric nurse in Fleming Island, Florida, and co-founder of the National Flying Squirrel Association. Didn't even know there was such a thing. Other members of Mrs. Barron's group have suggested calling the hybrids North American flying squirrels or Central flying squirrels, or even Glossomomi vobrenius, combining the Latin term for the southern and northern species. Steve Patterson, a Canadian educator who uses flying squirrels to teach ecology to school kids and other groups, says in presentations he already prefers to call the northern species Canadian. And the reason for that is because they are quiet, reserved, and peace-loving. Southern squirrels, on the other hand, are noisy and boisterous, and bullies. The northern flying squirrel, which is the larger but more docile of the two, he says. He wants the hybrids to be known as Glaucoma caminus, or Can-Am flying squirrels, giving Canadians top billing. So I think what you could do is go online and voice your opinion about that. I just thought I'd bring that to you on this Thanksgiving Day about how we named the hybrid flying squirrel. So this information that you can take into your everyday life now and know that we have a cause to stand for along with world peace. Today, on a Thanksgiving weekend, you've heard me talk many times about the power of gratitude. And there's a wonderful article by Lloyd Strom that I've referenced in the past around the stages of gratitude, and I used it actually yesterday in our foundations class around the three levels. The first level is the reciprocity. So when we say thank you, it's an acknowledgement that we're not alone, that there's someone helping us. There's someone, something or someone has assisted us, which is that idea of reciprocity, which is the first stage. And it's a valuable stage and a necessary stage, and most of the world practices that. Maybe not all, but most. There's some things going on right now in the United States around the government shutting down that maybe not a lot of that's going on at the moment. But the traditional gratitude is reciprocity. And then the second stage of this, and this is all about spiritual practice, and I think it just bears repeating briefly. In the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson, within every adversary, the second stage of this, within every adversary lies the seeds of some greater benefit. And the term that was used for this is called persipacity. It's a shift in perception to realize that whatever is going on in our lives, there's some greater good that's happening. Because this is how we move, this is how we evolve, this is how we learn, this is how we transform our consciousness. Within every adversity lies the seeds of some greater benefit. So persipacity, which is defined as acute mental vision or discernment. So the willingness to even be willing to say, well, there's some good here for me, and I demand that it be revealed to me. It allows us to be eternally grateful for the presence of good in our lives. And so, a very simple practice. I mean, if you can read, someone taught you how to read. I was thinking about this today, preparing, and I thought about who taught me how to swim. Can most people here swim? Somebody probably taught us how to swim. I know some people just got thrown into the water, but most of us had a teacher for most of the things we do. Someone helped us learn how to ride a bicycle. Someone learned to help us drive a car. All of these things. And so it's ongoing. When you come to the community, when you come to this community and you engage and you start to study and you start to read, what our offering is the possibility of a new perception. It's also as we deepen as we open up, as Ken was saying. Now, I've talked to Ken for months about John of God. And when we've talked, there was already a porosity in his consciousness of acceptance and willingness to kind of step into it and pursue it. Not everybody starts at that level of openness, and not that you should be. I mean, we have to examine these things at our own level of consciousness and awareness, and decipher and do our own filtering and do our own examination of things. It's just the way life works. But we all learn at our own pace, which is one of the things that I'm grateful for. This is a movement that allowed me to go in and out, back and forth, and in and out the doors of it over a period of time, because I found it many times to be very frustrating, because it was very slow. My journey felt very slow, and I wanted to accelerate it. So I would pull out and I would go take a fantastic weekend where my entire consciousness of my whole life would be revolutionized on a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And then I would come back from the workshop, and about Tuesday, I'd be right back into my old patterns of thinking. And so that was even more frustrating, because what was I promised it was going to be a complete change. And what I realized over time, and as I look at my own journey, it's been very gradual, it's been sequential, but it's been inevitable. And I haven't walked through the next doorway or the next threshold of awareness until I've completed sort of my learning at this level. But in the West, we'd like this to be very systematic. We'd like it to be a very straight line. I'm going to be the Christ consciousness by Tuesday, and then I'm going to take a trip to Europe and see France. So, and so part of what Ken was referencing in the John of God experience as well is it's a environment of just absolute present moment unconditional love. And one of the reasons I've undersold it or underdescribed it is because I can't describe it. I just say it's quite a I asked Roger Teal why he's been there 6 times, and he says, It's good enough for me. Okay, I think that means good. I'm going. I'm in. So perspicacity is that work that we do, that willingness to see God in everywhere I look. But it's work at that level of consciousness, at that level of awareness. As Ken said, to see the Christ consciousness. Well, so beautifully, as it says in our foundation course, we must become the Buddha before we can become the Christ. If you look at history, the Buddha came about 500 years before the Christ. And what the Buddha taught was meditation, mindfulness. So, and isn't that a beautiful example of what has to happen in consciousness? Because the sum total of consciousness on the planet had to open up to the possibility of an inner life and an inner awareness. And so the Christ consciousness, which is really about this life beyond what we would call the linear level. That his journey was one. I have to tell you, I don't know. I think the essence of truth of what that man and that life and that consciousness represents are spot on. All the details and all the things that I've read. I just read the book The Zealot, and I thought it was wonderful, and it's a historical example of what were the conditions that this man operated under. And I think it's brilliant because it explains a lot of what motivated him. But I also believe that there is a Christ consciousness, and I also believe there's a Buddha consciousness because I've been around it. When we talk about healing, for me, healing and people will come to me and say, I'm a healer. We're all healers. And so when we're around someone that's had a healing experience, of course they claim themselves to be a healer because something has profoundly shifted within their being. That's a beautiful thing. But it's not restricted to one. It's all of our opportunities. This is a room full of healing consciousness. This is a room full of porosity to possibility. What I love about this teaching is none of us are stuck. None of us have been so wrong in our lives. None of us have done something so horrible in our lives that there's not a possibility of some new idea, new possibility of moving forward. And the only way that can happen is to do our own spiritual practice, and a lot of it starts with forgiveness. And a lot of it starts with this shift in perception to realize I could have come no other way. I couldn't have learned this without having been exposed to that situation. I never would have appreciated abundance in my life if I had not struggled so long with and did my relationship with lack. We would not appreciate the light if we didn't understand dark. We would not be so joyful if we hadn't experienced sorrow so much. And it's not that we long for the sorrow, but sorrow is there for us because we get attached to things, and then things go away. People die, jobs end, relationships end. All of those things are part of the journey. And so it's not about it's not going to happen for us, but it's about us having an awareness and a perception in the experience that allows us to move to use it as another foundational piece of our consciousness. And to understand when we stand in the grace and the beauty of the eternality of our life. I was speaking to a young lady just before service, and for me, the whole John of God experience reinforced what I've had so many glimmers of. It didn't give me a new insight. It just gave me a fuller insight of what I have experienced throughout my life. So it wasn't a moment of brilliance. It was an hour or two of brilliance, where it was so clear that I couldn't even pull up what I thought were things that I needed to revenge in my experience perhaps, or wish were different. So it expanded an already understood experience. And then when I had that, I thought, wow, I want more of this. This is what I want my spiritual life to reflect in a larger way. And so there's a great gratitude in that. Because then I'm not in this stage of perspicacity. What it does is it moves me into this true gratitude, which is what this period is. When Jesus went to wonderful story in Scripture, and I referenced it briefly, I think it was last week. But he went to over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and it's in John. I'm referencing the Gospel of John. And John wrote about 100 years after Jesus, so you have to take it all with a grain of salt. But I believe the essence of what he was teaching is there, and I'll explain that in a moment. But Jesus was going to speak before, they say, 5,000. That's from Matthew, if you look at the 4 traditional Gospels. And in Matthew, so this crowd was there, and they said it was 5,000 men, actually. And so there are 5,000 men. There were probably 5,000 women, and there are probably kids there. So who knows how big the crowd was. And so the guys were there, and Philip said to him, Jesus, we got to feed people. Or no, Jesus, the discussion happened, how we're going to feed people. And Philip said, I got an idea. Which is, see, I could be Philip in this. Let's send everybody home and let them go get something to eat and come back. Isn't that a good idea? So that's what I would do. Oh yeah, it's time to eat. All right, we'll all get back here. We'll be back in an hour. Try and make it within the hour. We'll start preaching. And Jesus said, no. And of course, John in the gospel imposes upon Jesus' thought process. And so there were stages of it where let's send people away. And then he said to the disciples, who's got the money bag? And they said, Judas is carrying the money. How much money we got in the bag, Judas? And he says, no, what they got, it's not enough to feed everybody. It'll take 3/4 of a year's salary just to feed everybody. And even that, everybody will just get a bite. So right away, there's lack and there's not enough. And then one of the apostles brings this little boy over and says, look, this kid's got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. That's a start. And so, of course, according to the story, the fishes and the loaves were divided and everyone was fed, and there were 12 baskets left over. And so, it's a story about taking what is linear and what we would think is possible, and then moving our perception beyond that to invite a greater experience. But I think that the gem in all of it is if you go past a little bit in Scripture, and I don't have my Bible with me, or I'd read it to you, but in John, I think it's in 6:23 is where it's located, because I read it this morning again. And what John says after this, because it starts at 6:1 and it goes through 6:23 at least, and a bit further, what John writes is that they went the next day to the location and they didn't talk about feeding anyone. They didn't talk about a miracle. They didn't talk about dividing the fishes and the loaves. What John says is they went to the location where Jesus expressed gratitude, which I think is so significant, the power of gratitude. He didn't sweat bullets. He didn't work for a half an hour getting himself into a lather about making something happen. He wasn't screaming up to heaven. He just expressed gratitude. And I think it's just a metaphor in our lives of how powerful gratitude is, because gratitude is really that act of the acknowledgement of someone else that's supporting us, that we need each other, which is not a bad thing. It's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing that we need one another. But once we accept that and realize we need one another, then for me what it does is it softens my stance that I've got to do this all myself, that I'm all on my own here. In Abijania, when you go to John of God, they'll say your 50% is to always reach for the highest thought possible. I think Ernest Holmes would have said that. Ernest Holmes said, I foresee a day. And I gave this to Dr. Roger Teal. He wrote it in the Science of Mind article. I foresee a day when people will receive the healing that they're longing for and need to experience simply by walking through the doors of our community. Because he understood the power of consciousness, the power of unconditional love. And so as we do our work, see, what I'm grateful for today is that as we continue to do our work, we become that ambassador of possibility and love. But it's challenging for us. It is a challenge, and it's not easy. I was teaching the foundations class yesterday, and we were talking about, what happens for many of us. We come to the teaching, we're new to it, and all of a sudden we start having the honeymoon with the teaching. And we start to demonstrate parking spaces and relationships, and we find money on the ground, and all kinds of good stuff's happening, and it's like, wow, this is great. God's a vending machine, and who am I praying to anymore? That's a question that always comes up. With our prayer work is really to shift and change us. Because the presence of the infinite, this principle of unconditional love, just is. And so as we shift and change, we open ourselves up. We don't get God's attention or the goddess attention, because it's both male and female. It is not anthropomorphic. It is not although it represents itself in many forms. It's male and female in the form that we're in. And in Catherine Ponder's beautiful book, The Dynamic Laws of Healing, she talks a little bit in there. There's a little section in there called chemicalization. And I think it's really valuable to share this today on a day of Thanksgiving, because I'm so grateful for the opportunity for healing. I'm so grateful to know that whatever has happened, whatever has gone on in my life, and all of the opinions that I've gathered and have in my basket of consciousness and awareness that I'm carrying with me are just things I've selected along the way. And I can choose at any moment a different thing to put in my bag. And so she talks about chemicalization. She was a wonderful minister. I don't know if she's still alive or not, but her books are fabulous. And she said, you've heard it said that things have to get worse sometimes before they get better. It's getting worse. The getting worse process is actually a part of the improvement process. And what seems failure is actually success being born in the situation. That's chemicalization. This is often what happens in the minds and bodies of people when they try to deliberately practice the dynamic laws of right thinking. Holmes said to learn how to think is to learn how to live. But there's also this incubation period, there's also this giving birth period where it's difficult at times. They may feel nervous, frightened, agitated, and if they've been sick, their old diseases may flare up again. If they've been morally bad, the old desires and habits may take possession of them again. And if they have had previous financial problems, all at once things may seem darker and more hopeless than ever. In their human relationships, it may seem that everybody has turned against them and that inharmony is the order of the day. What has happened? Because I've seen this a number of times with people. She continues simply this: these people, myself included, for years have lived in wrong thought and molded these negative notions into their bodies and affairs. And now they have begun to do an about-face, thinking in terms of love, praise, forgiveness, release. Such reverse thoughts are a big dose for their system to take. And so there's a clash between the old and the new way of thinking. And this sets up a chemical reaction in the mind, the body, and affairs. And this is the gem. At such times, the good thing to remember is that one positive thought is more powerful than 1,000 rowdy negative thoughts. One positive thought is more powerful than 1,000 rowdy negative thoughts. The old way of thinking is on the way out, no matter how much noise it makes in the process. It has to go. But having been in control for so long, it doesn't want to give up without a fight. Even while it is flaring up for the last time, you can know that it is actually unconditionally surrendering and will soon be completely gone. Meanwhile, there seems to be a lot of excitement as it takes its last stand. And I think that beautifully articulates the journey, that it will not be without some discomfort. It will not be without something flaring up that challenges us. And to understand that and to keep doing our work. See, I know that in the United States, the government is shut down right now. And I think it's an example of the resistance to change. I read a beautiful article about what's happened and why this has flared up, and the resentments that are behind it. But it's fascinating how the newness requires sometimes that type of friction, and for us as well. And so that when you see it happening, it's not cause for failure, it's something to say, I'm so grateful for this. I'm so grateful that I'm challenging the status quo of my beliefs. I'm reminded of a lady that was in church one day, and the minister said, we're going to do an example here of healthy living. And he took 4 worms and he put 4 worms in different jars. And one jar was full of alcohol. And one jar was full of cigarette smoke. And one jar was full of chocolate. And one jar was full of rich soil that a worm would thrive in. And so they came back the next week, and sure enough, the worm that was put in the alcohol was dead. And the worm that was put in the jar with the cigarette smoke was dead. And the worm that was put in the jar with the chocolate was dead. And the worm that was in the dirt was thriving. And so he said to the congregation, have you learned anything? And this lady in the back yelled out, yep. She said, as long as I keep drinking, smoking, and eating chocolate, I will never have worms. But there's a shift in perception, is there not? All right. So on this Thanksgiving Sunday, to be together, to have this teaching in our lives, and to know that we're not stuck wherever we are. That we could have come no other way, that our journey was our journey like nobody else's, and to be able to continue to do our own work, to mind the depths of our being, so that not only do we, when we transform our lives, we assist one another in transforming their lives as well. Because we're not in this alone, we're in this together. So I say thank you, and so it is.